Metropolitan Ilarion here in Erie during the celebration weekend of our parish's 100th anniversary in July 2019, we conveyed to him our feeling of the necessity to clarify the events that led us to come under the omophoria of the bishops of Rokor, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, and the nature of the relationship between our parish and Rokor. We are particularly concerned now that this clarification take place to ensure that when the parties who have direct knowledge of these events are no longer alive, and the only one who's alive is me, or may be mentally incapacitated, and that's questionable whether I'm there or not, there will be no doubt as to the nature of the relationship of the Old Rite Church of the Nativity of Christ parish with the ruling synod of bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. Ladica Nicholas, we expressed to Metropolitan in that July 2019 meeting that we believe this is particularly important to us now because unlike when we united ourselves to the Church abroad in 1983, that was a time when many Greek Rite parishes had done so along with several OCA parishes. I think there was a very strong sense then that the Church abroad welcomed canonical Orthodox parishes, even if they were not worshiping precisely in accord with what I would describe as a dominant Jordanville Russian Rite. I didn't know that this might be offensive, and when I addressed them, I used a certain terminology and hoped they wouldn't be offended by it. I don't think they were. We simply want to make sure there's no doubt about the history leading to our union and the agreements about the rights of Old Rite parishes in the Church abroad. So this is more than merely the aspect with us. We have Steve Mitchell, that I know all of you are aware is in the process of forming a parish, or has formed a parish, and wants to bring it also into communion with the Church abroad, so it affects other parishes than ours alone. I'd included a document entitled Steps Toward Union with Rokor, along with all the relevant... My fingers are dry, and Father Theodore always yells at me for spitting my fingers onto the pages, so I try not to. The relevant correspondence between me, on behalf of our parish, and the Synod of Bishops of our church that took place between 1982 and 1984. Now, I didn't include here all of those steps, but what I did include, and I want all of you to be aware of this, I know some people say, well, why do we have to bother with this? Because I think it's really important that people know what we've agreed to and what's there. So if you take the second sheet, the second sheet, you'll see on the back of that, you see on the back of that second sheet where it says in late August of this year a study committee was formed. Okay, you don't need to read that. That was what I wrote to them back in 1982, telling them why we had come to a conclusion that this was a possibility. But on the next page is really the important aspect. On the bottom there, what you see, that says on the bottom of page 3, do you see that based upon the above conclusions? Everybody see where I'm at? Okay, on the third sheet of paper, it should say 3 on the top, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay, on the very bottom down there, based upon the above conclusions, everybody see that? And this is critical because this is the agreement. Really need some of these forms. Anybody have any of these left? These are the very terms that define our existence and whether or not we have peace with the church outside of Russia in the future. Based on the above conclusions and above all the readings, discussions, and debate which can be read by all parishioners in the minutes of the study committee, the committee makes the following recommendations. 1. Restoration of the fullness of the pre-Niconian Russian Orthodox rites is possible and desirable. 2. Such restoration should be accomplished by recognizing the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia as dogmatically orthodox and capable of providing a means of ordaining our priests. 3. Such a move should be accomplished only with the absolute understanding and agreement that A. Such ordination would never be used as a means to force or even urge the post-Niconian rites on our church or people. B. Our parish would always have the power and right to select and elect our priest, provided that he was not in violation of any canonical rules for candidates for the priesthood, and that he met educational and or experiential requirements for priesthood. C, that a priest so ordained would be guaranteed the right to remain as pastor of his parish as long as the parish desires, provided that he does not violate canonical rules for priests. D, that the control of the property of this parish and the administration of parish affairs be maintained by the congregation according to its controlling bylaws and or resolutions. E, that this parish could at any time decide by means of a congregational vote in accordance with controlling bylaws and or resolutions to cease any relations with the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. F, that the steps for restoration be finalized only after conditions A through E had been agreed upon by an officer or a hierarch or hierarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia with the authority so to do. We recommend the above recommendations, and on January 9th, 1983, in the community center at a special voting, people voted for one of two things. I am for restoration under Father Simon as outlined in the study committee letter of December 3rd at the present location, or I am against restoration as outlined by the study committee in the letter of December 3rd, 1982. Now, importantly also, that I want all of you to have this, skip the next sheet. Skip the next sheet, and hopefully you're on the last. And you should see extract from the minutes of the session of the Synod of Bishops. Is everybody see that? All right, so it says, on 19 January, 1st February 1983, the Synod of Bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, the report of his Grace Bishop Gregory concerning Pim and Simon, the pre-center of the Old Believer community in Erie, Pennsylvania, who had come to New York. He reported that the vast majority of his fellow Old Believers in Erie had decided to express their intention to unite. You can read the rest of this, but see, resolve. Look at the resolve. To give thanks unto the Lord who is leading those who had fallen away from the Holy Church into unity with the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, to receive Pim and Simon with all who agree with him into communion with the Holy Orthodox Church, in accordance with the old printed pre-Niconian rite of the fulfillment by a priest of holy baptism over those baptized by laymen. 2, the Synod of Bishops takes under advisement the resolution adopted by the old ritualist community, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to read more of this. So when I went before the bishops, what I said to them is I want to make sure, because I don't know what your record keeping is like. I have all of these documents from August 1982 through 1984, and especially these documents. I don't know whether you have them, and I want to make sure that you do have them, so I've given them all to you. And secondly, I want to make sure again that you understand all of these terms. The aspect was, and part of the question was, have we ever given you any trouble? There's any reason to believe there's a problem? I said no, but I am the last one alive who was engaged in this process, and therefore it's important that it's clarified. I think that one thing I can say to you is, if you go to the Synod website, Church Outside of Russia, if you go to the church outside, it's synod.com, I believe. If you see there as they report on their activities during this board, what they simply mention is on Friday, September 16th, they heard from me on various issues dealing with the old rite parishes. There was no decree that came out, but I think that certainly we can, I'll make a copy of that also, I think we have the full ability, even based on what Bishop John said, to assume that you didn't indicate any disagreement with anything I said. And therefore, if you didn't indicate any disagreement with anything I said, particularly when I made it clear what we were looking for, then we can assume, I think, that they accept all those provisions.
Shouldn't we be clear, though, Father, that a motion should have been made to accept the resolution? And just so there is clarification in the event of any confusion down the road.
We have a letter that we all drafted, and I have all the parish council. We'll still send it to Metropolitan Nicholas now, just to say, based on all of the things that happened, would you just agree to this letter and agree to the terms of the letter? So far I can push them. I mean, there really was an aspect a couple of times of, what problems do you have? You'll see why I'm talking about that otherwise. Okay, if you go back to the beginning sheet, because that was not the only issue. That was the first issue. We need to make sure that you certify or that you agree to all of these terms, because many of these bishops now have nothing to do with this. And by the way, one of the other things I do want to pass out, I want to make sure at our 40th anniversary, if you don't mind again, this is the list of the special committee that began meeting in late August, early September 1982. And there are some people still alive who are part of this. Katya Dunbar, you were part of that committee. Joe Peganoff headed up the committee. You can see these, and what I want to do is make a really nice plaque with some indication of our gratitude to these people who had the courage to do this. I don't remember, Joe, I'm sure you remember some of that. Katya, you remember. It was really stress-filled to go to that committee. It was a really stress-filled thing to go for months with people who were violently opposed to what we were doing, and it took a great deal of courage for the people who did that. So I hope to make this into some really nice plaque and indicate our thanks and gratitude. Again, there are a number of those people who are still alive. Mark, do you remember being on it, Mark?
That's my father.
Was that your father?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, anyway, and I tried very hard to have a cross-section of families. Not only people that I thought were in approval of what we were doing, but those I knew who were opposed to it. So it wouldn't be said later on that this was some sort of kangaroo court or something of that nature. Okay? So the study committee was meeting at this particular time 40 years ago. So if you go back again to the first sheet, that page. Okay, first sheet. You see number 2, secondly, a couple of years ago? Everybody see that?
Mm-hmm.
This is probably the most controversial to some extent. Secondly, a couple of years ago, we revised our bylaws to cover any situation in which a bishop of Rocor might automatically be consecrated for the Old Rite without any input from our parish or any other Old Rite parishes. I'm attaching the relevant language from that parish bylaw passage, Article 2, Section 1, for your inspection and for the inspection of the other bishops of Rocor. I would also like to discuss why we added this bylaw provision and make sure that it's acceptable to our bishops as well. I might add that on April 5th, May 9th, 1984, the Synod of Bishops of Rocor decides the old ritualist parish of the Nativity of the Savior in Erie, Pennsylvania is subject directly to the President of the Synod of Bishops. So please, if you will go now again to I think it's the 4th sheet, the next to the last. It says Article 2, Diocesan Relations. Everybody see that? Article Diocesan Relations. Okay, I want to read part of that because this is really important. This is something we changed. We had not consulted with our bishops, and this was the one I felt most of all, are they going to buy this or not? The parish shall constitute a part of the Old Rite. I don't think we have to go through that. Let's go to the second paragraph, the last paragraph. The parish at a special parish meeting shall be given the right to approve the appointment by the Synod of Bishops of the Bishop of the Old Rite. Should the parish not approve the bishop recommended by the Synod of Bishops to act as the bishop for the Old Rite, the parish shall remain under the omophorion of the Metropolitan First Hierarch of Rocor. Should the parish recommend a candidate for bishop of the Old Rite to the Synod of Bishops of Rocor, but not receive the blessing of the Synod for said candidate, the parish shall remain solely under the omophorion of the Metropolitan First Hierarch of Rocor, recognizing him as the ruling bishop of the parish as well as the First Hierarch of Rocor. In this scenario, before abandoning the recommendation of the candidate offered by the parish to act as bishop for the Old Rite, the parish would request the First Hierarch, or a bishop designated by him, to meet with the members of the parish in the same manner as outlined in Article 3, Section 2, regarding the denial of ordination of any candidate elected by the parish to be ordained as a parish clergyman. And as set forth in that section, denial of the candidate must not be in violation of the resolution of January 9, 1983, which you just read. What was the reason for this? So we did not request, we specifically requested in the beginning of 1984 that we wanted to be directly under the Metropolitan because a diocesan new bishop, a new right diocesan bishop might issue decrees and practices for parishes under his omophorion, that means under his authority, that might be antithetical to the Old Rite. I think I also have in this document that agreement of 1984 where the Synod of Bishops agreed to us being under the Metropolitan. In 1988, without any consultation, the Synod of Bishops decided to make Bishop Daniel our bishop. This is not a story that I'm making up. The way that happened is Metropolitan Vitali had approached Bishop Daniel, then Father Dimitri Alexandrov, and said, I would like to make you a vicar bishop for San Francisco. The Vicar Daniel said, I need to think about this. And he said to him, I was ordained as a priest for the Old Rite. If you make me a vicar bishop for San Francisco, it's likely that I'll run away. If you want me, this is what he said, if you want me to be a bishop, make me a bishop for the Old Rite. And Bishop Daniel called me one day and said, I'm going to be your bishop. And it was kind of ironic because we loved him very dearly, but Bishop Daniel had not really spoken to us for 2 years because he wasn't happy that we didn't have him design our new church. He had drawn design for the new church and we didn't use him. So anyway, When Bishop John became bishop, what happened with Bishop John is they wanted Bishop John to become a bishop for South America. Bishop John hemmed and hawed and called me 15 times, what should I do, what should I do, what should I do? And he was really uncomfortable, and I finally said, well, look, we're having a conference here in June of 2008. If you want, why don't you have them consecrate you according to the old rite in an old rite church? It'll make you feel more comfortable. And once he did, he was named the bishop for Caracas, Venezuela, but protector of the old rite, whatever that means. And I'm not sure exactly what that's ever meant. So in reality, and I've had some gentle discussions with Bishop John to some extent, saying to him, you're not really our bishop. Because you always say, I'm your bishop. Well, you're not really our bishop, but we're okay with that. But our concern is, in the future, what if they just decide to appoint a bishop, and that bishop has no affinity for the old rite, and then we find ourselves in a position where once he's our bishop, well, Nikita and Nika, you're part of that. We find our bishop giving us a particular directive and saying we don't want to be disobedient to our bishop. That's a very difficult thing, not to be obedient to your shepherd. So we basically put this in there. This was the one where several bishops said to me, why did you do this? Why are you doing this? Have you had a problem? No, but we don't want to have a problem. And as I've indicated, and I'll show that to you in the second part of this if we get to this today, one of the things that I had indicated to them, and I reminded them of the story, and again, I have this on this little sheet, but I want to remind you of it. When Father Theodore went with me in late January of 1983 to arrange negotiations for how we would come into the church outside of Russia, the leading priest, the leading administrative head of the church outside of Russia at that point, as we went through the terms that I had written up, said to me, you are drawing a divorce agreement before we're married. And I said to him, if we draw up a proper divorce agreement, then hopefully we will stay married. Well, the same thing is true with this aspect about bishops. If we make sure that we have made this clarified, then hopefully we don't run into a problem. They asked several questions, but there's no indication that they rejected it. So I have now brought this to the attention of the bishops of Rokor, which we hadn't done before. They know this is part of our bylaws now. We'll make sure that we send proper documents to let them know of that. But nevertheless, I think we covered our tracks on that and there was no problem. Anybody have any questions on that? The last one, and this is the one that really affects not only Steve Mitchell, but what I think is still going to be happening in the future. So go back to the first sheet again. This is point 3, back of the first sheet, okay? This brings me to my final point. Everybody see that? This brings me to my final point for consideration at this board, which actually is related to the first issue. A couple of years ago, a large family of very conservative Protestants in Missouri, you know those people? Have you seen them in our church? Became convinced that the true Church of Christ is the Orthodox Church. Their study led them to come into contact with the priesthood old believers in Oregon. Actually, it was probably Alaska, wasn't it?
It was Father Nicola.
Yeah.
We met in Oregon.
Okay. When they learned that these old believers were part of the Bella Cunitsa hierarchy who were not canonical, they came into Orthodoxy through an OCA parish not too far from them in Missouri. But as some time went by, although they were not unhappy with that parish, but because of some of the practices of the OCA, they followed Father Nikolai, or Nicola's, the rector of the Alaskan Priesthood Old Believer Parish, advice to find a way to unite themselves with our parish. I will explain more of the details how that came to pass when I speak at the Subor. Their family has driven all the way to Erie on numerous occasions to worship in our church and prayed with us every week and feast through our streaming services. Several members of the family thoroughly studied and learned Islamic chant to the point of having the ability to sing it quite well on their own. It is their intention to still be connected with our parish, but they are attracting numerous other Protestants to their reader services. Here's Philaret. You were Protestant, weren't you, Philaret? Mm-hmm. And because of this, wish to begin an old rite parish under the Omophoning of Rokor. While I understand that new rite parishes should not be converted into old rite parishes, I believe and trust that our bishops believe that in a situation such as this, in which the parish from infancy has begun using the old rite, the parish will be permitted to function as an old rite parish of Rokor in a manner similar to our relationship and position within Rokor. Stephen Mitchell, the father of the family, has been taken, blah, blah, blah. You have to read all these little details and read it later. Vladika Nicholas, it's been suggested that perhaps only historic old believers should be permitted to organize a parish utilizing the old rite, that is the pre-Niconian rite of the Russian Orthodox Church. If that were to be the case, such a decision to allow the old rite only for historic old believers would be very troubling. The vast majority of my parishioners no longer have Russian Old Believer roots. We even have about 20 Eritreans who attend our church and love the services, although they are far different than their Ethiopian Orthodox roots. I understand very clearly the hesitation to allow old ritualists to convert non-old ritualist parishes into old rite parishes, but to rule that Orthodox Christians who would choose to start a parish utilizing the old rite may not do so in the church abroad is to make the old rite and we old ritualists second-class members of the church. This letter is becoming too lengthy, and you're also saying it's becoming too lengthy. What I was concerned about was whether or not, and I really think this is going to begin happening. I have been contacted by a number of old believers in different areas and other people who have the desire. I had a call from a guy in Indiana the other day who's Orthodox and wants to be involved in the old rite. I have another guy who's a friend of Hayden's who's going to begin taking catechumen classes. And I think there are going to be some places where people want to use the old rite. The question was going to be, and part of the reason for this, if you ask why, is because I spoke to Bishop Peter, Archbishop Peter, who is the bishop for Missouri area, and Archbishop Peter had said he was fine with them starting a parish in the old rite, but then at some point in time he called Steve and said, okay, you can have a parish, and I'm going to send you a priest, and you're going to use a new rite. I told Stephen at that time not to reply until I spoke to the bishops at the Subord. The bishops of the Subord know this is the case, and once again, I believe even if you look at the synod results, there's no indication that there was any opposition to any of these areas that I addressed with the synod of bishops. Questions, anybody?
That's a lot of information, though.
Pardon me? I know.
Still.
So
I hope everybody's comfortable with, the reasons and whys. I really am particularly concerned. I also have a picture that I didn't include here. I actually attached with them a picture of Father Theodore, myself, then Father Dmitry Alexandrov, Father Vladimir Shishkov, and Bishop Gregory as we sat in the headquarter offices and synod as we negotiated our entry into church outside of Russia. So it would be very clear that we had entered into these practices. But again, other than Father Theodore, Father Theodore was there more as like taking me there because it was new to me to be in the synod headquarters. I think I told you this story before, but please forgive me, I'll make this quick. When I went there the first time, we're priestess all believers. So I go to this, maybe I said this to you at the Eve breakfast dinner, and I'm sorry if I did. We go there and we're invited to Bishop Gregory's apartment for dinner. I'm a priestess old believer going to a bishop's for dinner. So we go up there for dinner, and I'm really intimidated by the whole thing. And I remember at the dinner he had a Ballantine beer, and I'm sitting there going, a bishop drinks a beer? Is it all right for bishops to drink beer? And I told the bishops this at the synod meeting the last time. Archbishop Mark, Metropolitan Mark from Germany, busted into laughing. He laughed at the whole thing. I was glad he wasn't mad at me. Anybody?
Father, how many old rite churches are there in North America? Because I'm just trying to get a feel for the percentage of old rite versus...
Almost none. And in the aspect of that, we had this discussion this morning before church, Father Markel and I did. I think the reason for that very clearly, Nick, is because old believers, old ritualists, I really prefer calling old ritualists, starobraci, those who use the old rite, because we really don't believe anything different than the rest of the Orthodox Church believes. And that's what our course is going to be all about. They didn't come to America in any great numbers at all because they knew it was going to be an extremely difficult place to practice their very traditional form of orthodoxy. So what you had was 4 congregations of old believers who belonged to a particular subglacia, like a diocese. Erie, Pennsylvania, Mariana, Pennsylvania, Millville, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan. When we came to priesthood in English, we encouraged those other parishes that we belonged to basically follow the same pattern we did. They didn't follow it, and now they all are dead, and all telling me we should have done that. And then there's a large concentration of old believers up in Oregon and Alaska. Nikita and Nika come from Nikolaevsk, Alaska, where a lot of them are. I don't know, how many, would you guess at all about how many old believer people you think are up in Nikolaevsk? Because you're a small village, but you dominate. You formed the village, right? That was formed by Russian old believers, I think.
Yes, but so many of them moved to Oregon. I guess I would say our parish is probably at max, if we 50 to 60.
But you also have priestess old believers there.
Oh, hundreds.
Okay.
Hundreds.
So that's what I'm asking. You probably have several hundred to 300 old believers there, and then in Oregon, there's probably several thousand.
In our church, yes.
Yeah.
But even the priestess still outdo our
Yeah.
church. Maybe there's about 1,000 in our church over there.
You have really that many in the church in Oregon, 1,000?
Maybe all together, but like their church. You've been to their church, right?
Yeah,
in Oregon?
their consecration.
During Easter services and stuff, there's
Every-
probably about 20 people outside. You know, it's just packed.
Yeah.
But
We all know that feeling, the Creasters.
So Father, just to be clear, one time there was 4 around here, they've become extinct because, for a number of reasons.
Because
okay?
it's the same reasons we would have been extinct if we didn't have English and priesthood. We would have been extinct also.
So we're one standing here now, and you're saying that there's in Alaska like us that are English speaking, old rite, that have priests, or not?
They're Slavonic speaking. They're using Slavonic almost exclusively, and now their bishop in Alaska has actually forbidden them to use English as part of the reason Nikita and Nika are here, trying to decide what their future ought to be. But they're using Slavonic, and they're following the path that our own parishioners follow here. That is, people leave. I don't understand, and so forth.
I mean,
But they are priested under,
Yeah.
um,
A hierarchy that
hierarchy
recognizes
that's
no
not-
one else.
yeah,
So
it's
it's
not
not-
in communion with all of Orthodoxy.
It's not row court that they're under the authority of row court.
No, they're not under rock. Let me. Will you pass these out? I'd like to do this today, and I won't spend a lot of time on this.
If you don't mind, please, I just want to get, and then how many, do you have an idea of how many Roper churches are in do you have any idea?
400.
400?
Yeah, we're an infinitesimal minority. There's no question we're an infinitesimal minority.
And then you mentioned something, just to be clear though. What is the major difference between the old rite and then the non-old rite Russian Orthodox?
How you make the sign of the cross. In many ways, the differences have disappeared in English. A lot of it was language. There was in Slavonic, the word for Jesus was Isus, and then it became Isus in the New Rite. For us, we might look at that and say much ado about nothing, but these people thought it was much ado about something, and so there were a lot of grammatical things. Again, for those of you who know Slavonic, for example, we say Inine I prisno I vode kive kom amin. In the New Rite, they say Nine I prisno I vek vekov amin. So changes in grammar and so forth, change in the sign of the cross, changes in eliminating a lot of the prostrations, like in the prayer of St. Ephraim the Syrian. But what really happened over a period of time, to a great extent, was a great deal of westernization crept into the Russian church, particularly after Peter the Great. And what happened, the iconography changed, the music's very different. The music's very different. You grew up in Macedonian Orthodoxy, where your chant would have been fairly close to our chant. The Greek Byzantine chant is fairly close to our chant, but if you go into what I call the high Russian place, like Synod in New York, it's like listening to Italian opera in many places. So in many instances, it's more ritualist, and that's why we reunited ourselves with him. We reunited ourselves with him because they're still Orthodox, and there's no reason not to. Okay, I want to run through this very quickly. I know some of you may not think it's relevant, but as I've indicated here, the path to priesthood and fullness of sacramental life. And I don't think a lot of people in our parish are really appreciating what we were and what we came to. We came from the state of being priestless old believers without a bishop, without priests, without divine liturgy, without the Eucharist, without litanies, without blessing of loaves, without veneration of the gospel, without holy water, without anointing the sick, without absolution of sins at confession, without complete baptism, without chrismation, and with an abbreviated invented wedding service. And I'm not sure how many people still remember that was the state of being priestless. Joe and Katya, you can remember that, but most of you don't remember that any longer. And so I wanted to just go through, and a little bit of this, beginning of this, you might look at this and think it's a little ridiculous. But the reason I did it was, it didn't happen in space. How? How did we come from the state of being priestless old believers to the point that we came to be willing to have that study committee recommend that we unite ourselves to the church outside of Russia, which was a monumental decision? And so I thought about this a lot. How did that happen? And I started way back here and said in the summer of 1960, during Father Vladimir Smolikov's lectures at the summer seminary instituted by him, he explained, sorry for the typos, I did this quickly, to his students, which was Bob Murrow, anybody remember the Murrows and me, that after the 17th century schism in the Russian Orthodox Church, we old believers were deprived of divine liturgy, and the Eucharist, many places, which historically we had enjoyed. This at least created a knowledge in these students that our present condition was not complete and lacked essential attributes of Orthodox Christianity. So sorry, I didn't prove this obviously at all. And the only reason I again wanted to do that was the vast majority of priestess old believers have no idea that these things are missing. This is the way we always did things. We're all believers. We've kept everything. Therefore, if they have them and we don't, it's just because they've added something that we didn't do. In 1971, at the urging of the famous Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which maybe many of you don't know, Alexander Solzhenitsyn in 1971 at the support of the Moscow Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church said to them, "You feel that the persecutions against the Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, are horrendous. You need to pray to God that He will allow this persecution of the Church to end. But before God will hear your prayers, you need to rectify what you did to the old believers. And you need to stop this and end this schism with the old believers, because your persecution of them was worse than the persecution of the Soviets." And so in 1971, the Moscow Patriarchate, at its support, issued a formal decree lifting the anathemas against the old rite and old believers, inviting them back to the bosom of the Russian Orthodox Church, with the promise that they would be guaranteed the right to serve according to the old rite of the Russian Orthodox Church. Father Dmitry Alexandrov, at that time later to be Bishop Daniel III, in 1974, at his urging, at the urging of the famous Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, at its support of bishops in 1974, issued a formal decree lifting the anathemas against the old rite and old believers, inviting them back to the bosom of the Russian Orthodox Church, with the promise that they would be guaranteed the right to serve according to the old rite of the Russian Orthodox Church. So what are old believers going to do? And I did this, I don't like addressing things in the third person, but I didn't want this to be I. I wanted this to be a document that later says to you, not me talking, but it was Father Pimen. Father Pimen learned that Father Vladimir Smolikov and the other Pomorцы old believer in Nastavnike decided that the decision of the Moscow Patriarchate and the church outside of Russia proved the righteousness of the old believer position. They decided not to take any action as a result of the lifting of the anathemas. What I'm saying there is the attitude really was, and Father Smolikov put this in his 1974 calendar, basically, you see the Niconians finally admitted that they were wrong. This shows how right we are. What are we going to do about it? Nothing. Let's just kind of sit back and we're not going to do anything about it. In October 1976, Pimen and Maria met Christine Fitzurka. Remember her, Matushka? An Orthodox Christian who was a parishioner of Our Lady's Nativity Rocourt Church, that was Father Theodore's church on 5th Street. She explained that there were now English translations of many of the writings of the Holy Fathers that could be procured at either St. Tikhon's Monastery Seminary, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, near Scranton, Pennsylvania, or at Holy Trinity Monastery Seminary in Jordanville, New York. Pimen and Maria traveled to both monasteries, purchasing several $100s worth of these books, giving Pimen much easier access to reading the Holy Fathers, particularly on the subjects of the need for a bishop and the need for Holy Communion. 6. In December 1976, after leaving the practice of law and being blessed as a full-time old believer Nastavnik, Father Pimen met Father Theodore Yurevich. In conversations and meetings together, Father Pimen realized that much of the liturgical life practiced by new rite churches was much more similar to the liturgical practices of the old rite than he had realized. And Father Theodore was impressed how diligent old believers were in preserving the essential parts of the services that were possible without fully ordained priests. I really don't think we would have come to priesthood without Father Theodore. The communications and conversations that he and I had over a period of time were the ones that really led me to understand that the Niconian church, kind of the question that Nick asked, was really not some terribly different religion that had nothing to do with ours. In August 1979, Father Pimen and Father Theodore visited Holy Trinity Monastery on a scouting trip to see what the liturgical life at Jordanville was and what was the true attitude to old believers in the old rite among new rite Orthodox Christian leaders. While there, Father Pimen had his first meeting with priest monk Hilarion, who had become Bishop Hilarion and eventually Metropolitan Hilarion. During the visit, Father Pimen was shocked by the piety of the monks and seminarians and the devotion to such a rich liturgical life and adherence to a strict regimen of fasting and prayer. Father Pimen found mixed feelings there toward the old rite and the old believers. I was overwhelmed thinking I'd never seen old believers as diligent in their Orthodox practices as I saw in Jordanville. Certainly there were people there at Jordanville who didn't like the alt-right, and there were people who really liked the alt-right. So I left there still with a sense of, I'm not sure what we do. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, an OCA deacon from Connecticut who visited the Erie GE plant as part of his occupation began visiting Father Pimmon and his family, and several times attended services at our parish. He was highly impressed by the devotion of the parishioners and saddened by the inability of the parishioners to enjoy the fullness of Orthodox Christianity. In late spring of 1982, he had a retired Orthodox chaplain from his parish invite Father Pimmon to an annual clergy conference that was to be held at Vladimir Seminary in June of 1982. Father Pimmon attended that conference that lasted nearly a week, hearing lectures from noted OCA priests and theologians, Father Alexander Schneemann, Father John Meyendorf, and Father Thomas Hopko. The lectures greatly moved Father Pimmon. I was moved by the fact that hearing these lectures and these priests, I had a strong sense of what a lousy clergyman I had been. But the liturgical shortcomings and fasting regimen made it evident that the OCA would not be a right fit for an all-right parish. Again, I've told this story before, but in the schedule of services, daily services they would have matins at 7:30 and breakfast at 8. I hope you realize that's hard to imagine. In the spring of 1982, Father Pimmon read an Orthodox life that an Orthodox conference was to be held in Ipswich, Massachusetts, beginning on the feast of the prophet Elijah. He, his family, and several parishioners, Pearl Sabetti, Trina Watson, Marlene Meister, there were several others I can't remember, maybe Patty Gregoroff, was to be held. He and his family, several parishioners, attended that conference and were extremely moved by the piety of all proceedings and the love expressed to all of our parishioners. Having attended Divine Liturgy every day of the conference, Father Pimmon became determined to find a way to restore priesthood to the parish so that no further generations of Church of the Nativity parishioners would live without the liturgy and the Eucharist. I was absolutely convinced at that time that I would not continue in this manner. But Father Pantaleimon, who was the head of Holy Transfiguration Monastery, gave me really good advice, because I said I can't go longer without my family being chrismated and partaking of the Eucharist. And he said to me, if you do that, you will not be part of them any longer. And then you will not be able to lead them into priesthood. You have to forego this and ask God just to keep you safe and healthy, but you can't allow yourself to join and to do something, because then you won't be one of them any longer. By midsummer 1982, Father Pimmon was so intent on attempting to find a way to restore priesthood to the parish, he recruited a special committee comprised of approximately 40 parishioners from different factions of the parish to begin studying the history of the Christian Church, the history of the Russian Orthodox Church, the 17th century schism in the Russian Orthodox Church caused by the unilateral reforms of the Patriarch Nikon, and the current status of Orthodox Christianity in the world and the status of Starobrachество, old ritualism in the world. The committee was to begin meeting in late 1982. Joe Peganoff was kind enough to be the moderator, and that weren't no easy thing to do with that group of people we had, because there were really, really difficult meetings that we had. During the conference in Ipswich in August 1982, Father Pimmon had the opportunity to speak with Archbishop Vitali, later Metropolitan Vitali, and Bishop George Grabi about the possibility of restoring priesthood by unification with ROCOR. Archbishop Vitali was enthusiastically supportive of this possibility, suggested to Father Pimmon that he write a letter explaining his thoughts and plans to the ROCOR Synod of Bishops. Since Bishop George was the secretary of the Synod of Bishops, Archbishop Vitali told Father Pimmon to correspond with the Synod through Bishop George. And so all of the correspondence from this point on begins, and it's correspondence between myself and Bishop George. Of course, I would say to you that the parish did not know I was engaged in these correspondences. It had to be done in that particular manner. I won't go through all of this, but let me at least give you a sense. On August 12, 1982, Father Pimmon requested Bishop Gregory the opportunity to address the Synod of Bishops meeting. That's document 1. You don't have that attached here, but if anybody wants these, I have all these documents. I really want people to have some of these, so as further generations go on, people understand what really happened. On August 23, 1982, Bishop Gregory responds, requesting Father Pimmon to prepare and send a report to the Synod, stating the goals the parish and other old believers wish to come to fruition. Again, I can be glad to give it to you. The special committee begins its bi-monthly meetings that will last until early December 1982. As indicated, we met, I think, do you remember, Joe, once a month, once every other week? I don't remember. But it went on for like 4 months. On September 8, 1982, Father Pimmon composes and sends a report stating that the reason reconciliation is now possible is because of the lifting of the anathemas in 1974. Further, he sets forth what conclusions old believers must rationally make about the present validity of the hierarchy of Rokor, along with the terms under which old believers, at least the parish in Erie, would consider reconciliation, the restoration of priesthood and union with Rokor. Documents 3. On September 16th, the Synod of Bishops resolved to accept the terms set forth in Father Pimen's position paper and appoints Father Pimen rector contingent upon his ordination to the priesthood, which is to be celebrated according to the quote-unquote ancient rite. In late November, the special committee votes by a vote of 33 in favor, 7 opposed, in favor of unification with Rokor, with the stipulation that guarantees will be provided to ensure that the parish will always be able to serve according to the pre-Niconian rite of the Russian Orthodox Church. On December 3rd, 1982, with the Bylaw, I read that to you already, so I won't read this again. 19. On December 12th, the parishioners of the Lord's Nativity at the special congregational meeting agreed to hold a special day of balloting, with the only choices on the ballot to be, I'm for restoration under Father Simon is outlined in the study committee letter. And I'll tell you why that wording was used. That wording was used because it was understood that a significant portion of our parish who really were not active, really didn't know, had no idea what this was all about, and the position was the people who indicated this, just put they're going to follow you or not follow you. So basically, people who think you're doing the right thing will vote yes, and the other ones will vote no. That's why it indicated under Father Simon, or I'm against restoration. And on Sunday, January 9th, the results of the day of voting led to a 2/3 plus majority in favor of restoration. You might know that on January 7th, on our Christmas, the people opposed it has put a large ad in the Erie paper indicating vote no on this thing, and you can see it on the collage out there in the hallway. February 1st, 1983, I talked about this. And 22 is this, about us getting together. I talked about this also. The rest of the dates you can look at yourself. The last one I think that's important here is 24 and 25. In May of 1984, Father Pimen wrote a letter to Bishop Gregory reminding him that all correspondence and discussions between him and the Synod of Bishops was to the effect that the Church of the Nativity of Christ was not to be considered part of the Eastern American diocese, but was to fall under the direct jurisdiction of the Metropolitan. The reasons for this request go to the uniqueness of the parish being an Old Rite parish, and on May 9, 1984, the Synod Bishops resolved that the Old Ritualist Parish of the Nativity of the Savior in Erie, Pennsylvania, is subject directly to the presence of the bishops. After that, the other dates are the consecration of Bishop Dan and the consecration of Bishop John. I hope that's not boring, but I think it's important. I just think it's important that people really understand what happened or how this process took place, because we know a lot of the events that have happened in this parish, people don't know. We walk around saying, how did that happen? Just an example that I started that and nobody wanted to hear at that supper that one day, was this church was open, consecrated to the extent it could be consecrated on August 28, 1919. Father Nikken didn't become the first nastavnik or minister priest until 1923. What happened between 1919 and 1923? I didn't care in the early years. I didn't ask that question, and now we don't know. That's why I'm saying this document here, put it in files that you have in your own house so somebody can know this.
You should put it in a newsletter or something, and make sure it's in the archives.
Well, it'll certainly be in the archives. Right.
Father, what were the, I've heard so many, but no one, other than normalized changes, okay? So the fear of a change, kind of similar to, we're gonna go, let's just say, abandon the old rite and do the new rite, but we're doing it the same, and then there's a fear of that. So I don't understand, when you guys had all this issue, anybody logical would go through this and say, first of all, do you believe in communion? Do you believe in all these other rites you're not getting right now? We can make that happen. We went all these years without it, and you've always said, what happens to your soul if you don't take communion? This whole stuff. I'm like, what happened to all these people? That's a whole side issue, but I just am amazed when I listen to this. What was the big objection to moving forward, other than a fear of new? If you outlined it to everybody, saying we're going to do everything we're going to do, but we're going to be under a different jurisdiction. You're not going to have authority over us. You're going to have the ability to have real weddings, take communion, get anointed, do real baptisms, and everything you've outlined. Why would anybody that's rational object to that? I just don't understand that.
And I want to try to wrap this up fairly soon, because I told you we'll be done every week by 11:30, and I promise we will. This may be a little long. But I'm going to answer that with a very short story that, again, I may have told. It's relevant, I think. when I went to Colgate, when I was my freshman year, you could drink at 18 years of age. And Colgate was a really big drinking school. And there was a little Jewish guy, a wrestler, I remember, on the floor of my dorm. And every time he got drunk, he would run around the dorm going, "Why 6 million? Why 6 million?" Well, the Old Believers really exaggerated that millions of Old Believers were persecuted and killed during the persecutions. There were persecutions, and some Old Believers were killed. Many of them, the persecutions against the Old Believers were more subtle. You have to pay tax to wear a beard and some other things of that nature. But the general thing was the exaggeration came on after years. As a matter of fact, I have a copy of a conference that was held in 1984, the people who left us. Basically, the conference was called to find every way they could possibly think names to call me. But in any event, in that conference, they said 13 million Old Believers died, which is nuts beyond belief. But the main argument always was, they killed our forefathers. Our forefathers died for this. And we're never going to go with these people because they killed our forefathers. And of course, the point I always make to them is, how long will you continue to hold people responsible for things that happened decades, centuries ago? And that's one of the discussions that we had with the synod themselves, when they would say, they're dead, they're all dead, whatever happened in the past, we're sorry about it, but it's gone. That was the main objection. We'd be betraying our forefathers. Our forefathers would turn over in their graves that we did this. And you guys probably hear this up there. You probably hear the same thing. Yes, Sophie?
Oh, another question. So, I remember when I was younger, like a little girl, I was told, oh, you can't take communion in the Greek church or other churches. Is that something that changed? Like, everything you've outlined goes up to 1988, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, and then you have 2008 here. So when did that become a thing that you could take communion in the other churches?
So in 2006, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia held a Subbot in San Francisco, I was a delegate to that Subbot, and they decided at that time to reconcile themselves with the church in Russia. They did that in Ascension in 2007. When they did that, they really found themselves back in the bosom of the entire Orthodox world. So we really are in communion with the rest of the Orthodox churches. The only thing that I often tell people, and Sophie, you probably know this better than a lot of the people in this church, is many of the other Orthodox jurisdictions, not ROCOR so much, their liturgical practices are really, from an Orthodox perspective, really scandalous. And so I often say, yeah, you can take communion at a particular place. But for example, if they're not having Vespers and Matins and no pre-communion prayers and no preparation, you shouldn't be, because it's not an Orthodox practice. So yes, we are in union with the rest of the Orthodox world now, and you actually can commune at other Orthodox churches. But I do tell, like if you were to go to a ROCOR church, where a ROCOR church really does have a proper preparation for communion and vigils and so forth, yes, you can. That happened in 2008. 2007, when the Russian Orthodox Church reconciled with the church in Russia. Yes, Steve, and I'll end it. I'm really sorry. I don't want to go too long. And some people may say, why did we do this the first class? I just felt this is really important, and to a certain, I've shoved it down your throat. But I feel it has to be, because people go, I don't care until it's too late, and then people will care. Yes, Steve.
Vladika Daniel was opposed to that, wasn't he?
Vladika Daniel was opposed to it, but Vladika Daniel by that time was really in partial dementia. I mean, there was a certain level with him that there was a great deal of confusion, and he was getting a lot of pressure. As a matter of fact, there's a bunch of documents that I wrote on behalf of Bishop Daniel during that period of time, because there were the people who were opposed to that. That's a whole different thing than we talked about earlier. They were trying to get him to oppose the reconciliation and trying to use him at that particular time. We actually had to protect him. I'll be glad to answer that if you want to talk about that sometime. My apologies for this going long. My apologies if perhaps it was a little too formalistic, but I think it's good. So, if you can, just read those few pages of Orthodox dogmatic theology. You'll find then that there are discussion points. The discussion points will be on those pages. That's what we'll do every week. I will have discussion points made for the following week, so then we can have a discussion, not sitting here saying, okay, we're just going to sit here and read like I did today. All right?
Thank you very
And
much.
please don't forget about questions too. A lot of you said you wanted questions. Whether you want to do them, here or anonymously, please feel free to do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for recording this, Nathaniel, because I had a bunch of people tell me they couldn't be here and asked me to record this, so thank you.